Good morning. Today's sermon is from John chapter 9, verses 1 to 41. Please familiarise yourself with the text before listening to the sermon. Can you imagine yourself in this scene? You've been blind since birth, and one day you're out for a walk, minding your own business, when you hear a group of men's voices approaching you. You stop so as not to bump into any of them and expect them to walk around you. But then you hear their conversation. Maybe they don't expect you to hear them, but you've grown used to, depending on your hearing, to compensate in some way for your loss of vision, so you hear what they're saying clearly. At first, what you hear makes you feel sad, angry and annoyed, because you hear the same old prejudice and tripe that's always been said about the reasons for your condition, whether it was you or your parents who'd sinned that caused you to be born blind. You wonder, what dreadful sin could you have committed in your mother's womb to cause God to make you blind? But you've rationalised this before, and you think might have been your parents' sin. After all, don't the scriptures say as much in Deuteronomy chapter 5? You've even had people read it to you so that you know why you're blind. It says, I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents, to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me. When you heard that read, you thought, so it might not have even been my parents' sin, but possibly that of my grandparents or even my great-grandparents. But then one of these men says something completely different and new, something no one has ever said about you before. This man speaks with authority, though, and you hear him say, his blindness has nothing to do with his sins or his parents' sin. He is blind so that God's power might be seen at work in him. As long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I'm in the world, I am the light for the world. Wow. You've never heard anyone talk like that before, but what does he mean when he says that you're blind so that God's power can be seen at work through you? How can a blind person reveal anything about the power of God? In fact, would it not be the reverse? Your blindness shows God's limitations to deal with the fallenness of humankind. And as for the rest of what this man says about night and day, well, that just sounds like gibberish. Well, it might have sounded gibberish to the blind man, but it shouldn't do to us, because we have the benefit of knowing things about Jesus that we've previously read about in John's Gospel. Previously, in the stories of Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman at the well, Jesus uses images of light and darkness to convey belief and unbelief. Nicodemus comes to Jesus in the dark and finds it hard to believe what Jesus says, whereas Jesus meets the Samaritan woman in the broad light of day and she believes in him. In this story of the blind man, Jesus is referring to a time where there will be so much unbelief that it'll be hard to see God's miracles take place. Is the fear of the coronavirus beginning to cause such widespread unbelief in the power of God today? If you're feeling afraid, then turn to these scriptures and others and remember that this power of Jesus is still able to do everything that he did and even more. Jesus himself tells us this in John chapter 14, verses 12 to 14, when he says, very truly, I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works I've been doing, and they will do even greater things than these, because I am going to the Father. And I will do whatever you ask in my name, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. You may ask me for anything in my name, and I will do it. Back to our scripture story. Now, I might not recommend following Jesus' next actions in today's world. You can imagine if you were the blind man wondering what Jesus is going to do to you. But you probably wouldn't have imagined what he actually did. He places mud on your eyes. You even hear him spit on it to make it soft. Disgusting or what? He then tells you to go and wash it off in the pool of Siloam. Well, you don't need to be told twice, do you? This crazy man has just covered your face in a mixture of mud and his own saliva. What else would you be thinking of doing except go and wash it off immediately? So you go away muttering to yourself about why so many people take advantage of you because of your condition. Bad enough having to listen to their comments, but this weirdo has just taken it to a new level. You arrive at the pool and you wash, but when you've wiped the water away from your eyes and blink, something extraordinary happens. The light looks different. You blink again, and you begin to see colours, shapes, outlines of things, people. You're seeing the world for the first time and your mind is on sensory overload. After several minutes of staring in wonder and amazement, you gather yourself up and decide you've got to run home and actually see the faces of your parents for the first time. But then on the way you recognise some of the voices of your friends and neighbours and you excitedly tell them about your amazing news, but you don't get the reaction you expect. No, despite having lived amongst them all of your life, talked with them and even received help crossing the street at times from them, they fail to recognise that it's actually you. Their unbelief is such that they remain in darkness as to the possibility of God working a miracle. They even say it's someone who looks like you, but not actually you. And you realise sadly at this time that the only marker of your identity was the fact that you were blind. You remember even hearing the comments, "Oh, watch out for blind Sam, you're going to bump into that cart. Oh, here comes blind Sam, how are you doing today? There's poor old blind Sam, let's play a trick on him, see him trip over the barrel we've placed in his way." You know, we as a community can learn from these reactions in terms of how we view people who are differently abled. How do we identify and come to know people who are different from us? Do we allow disability to be the defining marker, or are we able to look beyond this and recognise the humanity of all people? How limited or keen is our sight when we're with people who are differently abled? Ken Gear wrote a beautiful book entitled Windows of the Soul, and the main point I took from it was to try to give time to everyone to whom you come in contact. Often we meet people and there's something about them, isn't there? Their speech, their look, their smell, their lifestyle that makes you want to get away from them as quickly as possible. But Gear says maybe if we just took a few moments to peer through the window into their soul, then just maybe God would bless us by revealing something beautiful, something unexpected. By the age of 9, Gilbert had grown into a boy of alarming proportions. He was as tall as most men, but had a voice an octave higher than the other boys his age. He went to a brain specialist who said that the boy's brain was the largest he'd ever seen, and that he'd either turn out to be a genius or an idiot. It was several more years before his anxious parents knew which their son would be. For a while it seemed like the idiot side was winning. Gilbert would show up at school, find it empty, then remember that it was Saturday. But he could memorise long passages of Shakespeare and Dickens and loved reciting them aloud as he walked down the street. Of course, this only caused his classmates to consider him a freak. The true nature of Gilbert's brain was revealed when he was 15. After a fight with a much younger kid, his opponent quoted Dickens, and this launched them into a discussion which grew then into a friendship that transformed Gilbert. To a small circle of his fellow students, he was no longer Gilbert the freakish giant, but Gilbert the brilliant giant. He'd won their respect. This circle of friends became a debating club, which helped sharpen Gilbert's reasoning skills. Then the club began to publish a magazine. Through his contributions to the magazine, Gilbert became a writer. Years later, after depression that nearly ended in suicide, this argumentative, well-reasoned, lonely thinker would eventually argue, reason, and abandon himself into faith in Jesus. British writer Gilbert Keith Chesterton turned his enormous brain into a writing machine, pouring out fiction, humour, poetry, drama, political commentary, and perspectives on faith at a greater rate than any other Christian writer. His collected works included thousands of articles and essays, hundreds of books, and contributions to hundreds more. And the results, millions of people in the English-speaking world got their first glimpse of God. Though God gave G.K. Chesterton great success in life, he used the worst episode in the writer's life to make that success possible. Those moments were episodes that most people would avoid if possible. His odd physical traits as a child led to isolation, introspection and brilliance. A playground scuffle led to an unlikely friendship that gave Gilbert an audience for his talents. His passion for arguing allowed him to hone his logical and persuasive communication skills, and a near suicide triggered a search for meaning that ended at Jesus' feet. G.K. Chesterton is proof that our God really does use even bad things for good. You see, the window to G.K. Chesterton's soul was his love of literature and poetry, but for a time all he encountered was prejudice over his physical appearance. Had his friends refused to accept him because of his appearance, then possibly they and the world would have been deprived of something beautiful and precious. Back to our gospel story. The second problem the man with the newfound sight encounters is with the religious establishment of the day, the Pharisees. They don't want to hear or believe the man's story because it opposes the story they want to tell. They want Jesus to be a sinner, not the hero of the story. They want another explanation. They too, like the man's friends and neighbours, are blinded to the truth. They're more concerned that he'd been healed on the Sabbath because on this day all work was prohibited. On another occasion in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus encountered similar accusations from the Pharisees who observed his followers picking grain. Jesus then explained to him that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. His point being that the Sabbath was created to serve man by allowing them a day of rest, but they turned it something good into a legalistic rule that put them in the dark over what God originally wanted. Amazingly, the blind man had the courage to stand up to these religious leaders and refused to denounce Jesus as a sinner. He simply explained to them that Jesus could not have healed him if he were not from God. But they were blinded to this miracle and threw him out. Mind you, this wasn't until the man had received another kick in the teeth, because when the Pharisees summoned his parents to quiz them about whether or not he'd been born blind, although they confirmed this, they were obviously afraid of the Pharisees excluding them, and so they distanced themselves from what their son was saying by telling them to ask their son directly as he was a man. Maybe we can understand the fear of an older couple of being excluded from the community in those days. That have lost their work and undoubtedly their friends and probably their home, but should we not have expected them to celebrate with him and to be joyful over his healing? There's nothing of that found in the text. The parents' fear for the Pharisees overwhelms their joy and they abandon their son to the authorities. These are fearful times, and people respond in ways that they shouldn't when confronted with fearful situations. But we as Christians should remember that our gospel is one of hope and assurance, and we need to point all people to the one who brings life and hope for all eternity. Despite the fact that the man's parents and the Pharisees failed and abandoned him, we should take hope that Jesus did not. It was Jesus who stood with the man in his final isolation. And the good news is he stands with us too. Notice that Jesus in the end comes to the man, not the other way round. And he comes to us in our isolation too, filled with compassion. Jesus will never leave you nor forsake you. You might feel abandoned by those you respected and loved. You might feel isolated because of this virus. But his is a love that will never let you go. So in these trying times, let us continue to put our faith and belief in the God of miracles, and may his light shine in these dark days. Amen.